On a cold morning in November 1916, somewhere in the torn earth along the Somme, a German soldier named Wilhelm crouched in what remained of his dugout. The British bombardment had been going on for hours. The ground shook. Timber supports cracked and groaned. Dirt cascaded from the ceiling with each explosion. Wilhelm had been a schoolteacher before the war, a quiet man who enjoyed philosophy and classical music. Now he waited in the darkness, rifle clutched in trembling hands, listening to the approach of yet another British attack. When the shelling finally stopped, Wilhelm and his comrades climbed the ladder to their firing positions. Through the smoke and dust, they saw them coming, wave after wave of khaki-clad figures advancing across no man's land. The British soldiers moved at walking pace, disciplined formations maintaining their lines despite the machine gun fire tearing through their ranks. Wilhelm watched men fall, watched others step over the bodies and continue forward. He watched them reach the barbed wire, saw them cut through it or try to climb over it, all while his machine gunners poured fire into them. And still they came. That night, after the attack had finally been repulsed, Wilhelm wrote in his diary. His entry did not speak of cowardice or weakness in the enemy. Instead, he wrote of something that surprised him, something that would surprise many Germans throughout both world wars. He wrote of courage, of determination that bordered on madness, of an enemy who simply would not stop, would not break, would not accept defeat no matter how many of them fell. The British soldier, he concluded, was unlike anything the training manuals had prepared him for. This is a story about perception, about how German soldiers, from the professional officers of the Imperial Army to the hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht, viewed their British opponents across two global conflicts. It is a story of respect earned in blood, of prejudices challenged by reality, and of enemies who, despite fighting to the death, came to understand each other in ways that the civilians back home never could. Understanding what Germans thought about British soldiers matters for reasons that extend beyond mere historical curiosity. These perspectives reveal truths about the nature of warfare, about national character as expressed under extreme duress, and about the complex humanity that persists even in the midst of industrialized slaughter. German soldiers wrote letters, kept diaries, published memoirs, and gave interviews. They observed their British opponents closely, sometimes across a few hundred yards of cratered earth, sometimes through the sights of a rifle, sometimes while taking them prisoner or being taken prisoner themselves. Their assessments were not propaganda. They were the evaluations of professional soldiers, trying to understand the enemy they faced, trying to predict what the British would do next, trying to survive against an opponent who proved far more formidable than many had expected. These German perspectives, preserved in military reports, personal accounts, and post-war interviews, provide a unique window into how the British Army was perceived by those who fought against it most directly. The story begins in 1914, when a small professional British force crossed the Channel to face the massive German army driving through Belgium and France. It continues through the mud of Flanders, the hell of the Somme, the grinding attrition of 1917 and 1918. It resurfaces in the deserts of North Africa, where Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps battled the British Eighth Army across hundreds of miles of sand. It climaxes on the beaches of Normandy and in the fields of northwest Europe, where German veterans found themselves once again facing the sons and grandsons of the men they had fought a generation before. What did they see when they looked across at the British soldier? Did they see the propaganda caricature of a soft, decadent people grown weak from comfort? Did they see the reality of professional soldiers, products of an island nation with centuries of military tradition? Did their opinions change as the wars progressed, as initial victories gave way to grinding stalemates and eventual defeat? The answers are more complex than simple respect or contempt. German soldiers held nuanced views that evolved over time, that varied by branch of service and theater of war, that reflected both the realities of combat and the prejudices of their culture. They respected British courage while questioning British tactics. They feared British material superiority while sometimes dismissing British fighting spirit. They admired individual British soldiers while criticizing British commanders. They learned hard lessons about underestimating an enemy that many had expected to be easily defeated. This is not a story of villains and heroes. It is a story of soldiers, men who shared the experience of fear, exhaustion, courage, and horror across the barbed wire and minefields that separated them. Men who, despite speaking different languages and fighting for opposing causes, recognized in each other something of themselves. The German perspective on British soldiers reveals as much about the Germans as it does about the British. It shows us how men at war think about those trying to kill them, how respect can coexist with enmity, and how the reality of combat often shatters the illusions promoted by governments and newspapers. The letters Wilhelm wrote home from the Somme, the memoirs Ernst Jünger published after the Great War, the interviews conducted with captured German officers in World War II, all tell variations of the same story. The British soldier was not what they expected. He was tougher, more determined, more dangerous than the propaganda had suggested. Fighting him was not the swift victory that had been promised. Defeating him, if it could be done at all, would require everything the German army could muster. And in the end, it would require more than they had to give. When war came in August 1914, the German army that surged westward through Belgium represented what many considered the finest military machine in the world. Built on the Prussian system of universal conscription, rigorously trained, superbly organized, and led by officers schooled in the military academies that had produced some of history's greatest strategic thinkers, the Imperial German army numbered over 3 million men. They advanced according to the Schlieffen Plan, a carefully calculated strategy designed to knock France out of the war within 6 weeks through a massive wheeling movement that would envelop Paris from the north. Standing in their way, among other obstacles, was the British Expeditionary Force. The BEF that crossed the Channel in August 1914 numbered just over 100,000 men, 4 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division. Unlike the German army, which relied on conscripts serving 2- or 3-year terms, the British force was entirely professional. These were long-service soldiers, men who had chosen the army as a career, many of them veterans of colonial campaigns in India, South Africa, and Afghanistan. They were the product of an empire that had maintained a small but highly trained standing army for policing its vast overseas territories. German intelligence had assessed the BEF, of course. Reports noted its small size, which seemed almost laughable compared to the millions Germany could mobilize. Some German officers dismissed it as barely worth considering, a token force sent to maintain British honor but unlikely to affect the outcome of the campaign. Kaiser Wilhelm II himself reportedly referred to the BEF as a contemptible little army, a phrase that British soldiers would later embrace with fierce pride, calling themselves the Old Contemptibles. The first significant encounter between German and British forces came on August 23, 1914, at the Belgian town of Mons. The British had taken up defensive positions along the Mons-Condé Canal, a waterway that provided a natural obstacle reinforced by British entrenchments and barricades. The German First Army, commanded by General Alexander von Kluck, approached expecting minimal resistance. What they encountered instead shocked them. British infantry, positioned in hastily dug trenches and firing positions, opened up with rifle fire of such volume and accuracy that many German soldiers believed they were facing machine guns. The British Army had long emphasized marksmanship. A trained British soldier was expected to fire 15 aimed shots per minute, and many could exceed 20. When concentrated into coordinated fire by sections and platoons, the effect was devastating. German infantry advancing in their traditional dense formations were cut down in swaths. Captain Walter Blome, a German officer of the 12th Brandenburg Grenadiers, wrote about his experience at Mons in his memoir. He described the advance of his regiment across open ground toward British positions. The men moved in good order, confident, singing as they marched. Then the British opened fire. Within minutes, the neat ranks dissolved into chaos. Men fell everywhere. Officers shouted commands that no one could hear over the sound of rifle fire. Soldiers who tried to continue forward found no shelter, no cover, just open ground, swept by bullets that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Blome watched his battalion disintegrate. Companies that had crossed the start line with 150 men emerged from the killing zone with barely 30. The ground was carpeted with German dead and wounded, and yet, incredibly, the British positions had barely been touched. The German artillery, which was supposed to have suppressed the enemy, had largely missed the well-concealed British entrenchments. The machine guns that were supposed to support the infantry advance had been unable to identify targets to shoot at. The Battle of Mons lasted just one day. Despite the German losses, the sheer weight of numbers eventually forced the British to withdraw. But the encounter left a profound impression on the German soldiers who survived it. These were not the soft colonial policemen they had been led to expect. These were professional soldiers who knew their business, who could shoot straight under pressure, who maintained discipline even when outnumbered and outflanked. As the BEF retreated, fighting a series of rearguard actions over the next 2 weeks, German respect for their British opponents grew. At Les Cateaux on August 26th, the British Second Corps turned and fought a desperate defensive battle to prevent the Germans from enveloping the entire BEF. Once again, German infantry advancing across open ground encountered rifle fire and artillery fire of such intensity that attacks simply melted away. German after-action reports noted with grudging respect that the British fought with a cohesion and professionalism that made them extraordinarily difficult to dislodge from prepared positions. German officers began reassessing their initial dismissive attitudes. Reports sent back to headquarters emphasized that the British force, while small, was proving to be a tough opponent. The soldiers were well trained, their shooting was excellent, and their discipline under fire was remarkable. More concerning still, they retreated in good order, maintaining their combat effectiveness even after days of continuous fighting and forced marches. The retreat from Mons tested the BEF to its limits. Soldiers marched for days with little food or rest, fighting desperate actions to hold off pursuing German forces. Equipment was abandoned, stragglers collapsed by the roadside, units became separated in the confusion. Yet somehow the force held together. German pursuit columns kept expecting the British to break, to dissolve into a panicked rabble. It never happened. Even exhausted British soldiers retained enough discipline to turn and fight when ordered to do so. At the First Battle of Ypres in October and November 1914, German forces made one final attempt to break through the Allied lines and reach the Channel ports. The fighting centered on the Belgian city of Ypres, where a mix of Belgian, French, and British forces held a salient that jutted into the German advance. The Germans threw everything they had at the British defenders, including newly raised volunteer units filled with enthusiastic but poorly trained students and young men eager for glory. These German volunteers attacked with tremendous courage but little tactical skill. They advanced in dense masses, singing patriotic songs, straight into British rifle and machine gun fire. The slaughter was horrific. In just a few weeks of fighting around Ypres, Germany lost nearly 150,000 men, a significant portion of them from these volunteer units. German veterans of the professional army watched the volunteers die with a mixture of sorrow and horror. The British soldiers they faced gave no quarter, showed no mercy. They simply fired, calmly and methodically, until the attacks stopped.
But if the German volunteers died in large numbers, the British professional soldiers died too. By the end of 1914, the original BEF had suffered approximately 90,000 casualties out of its original strength of 100,000. The old contemptibles were being wiped out. Yet, even as they died, they inflicted casualties on the Germans far out of proportion to their numbers. German officers noted that fighting the British was proving to be more costly than fighting the French, whose forces were larger but less professionally trained. A German regimental history of the 112th Infantry Regiment recorded impressions of the fighting at Ypres. The unknown author described British defenders who refused to retreat even when their positions were being overrun. He wrote of British soldiers fighting from behind barricades of their own dead, of wounded men who continued to fire until they collapsed from blood loss, of an enemy who seemed incapable of recognizing when a situation was hopeless. The German soldiers found this behavior both admirable and deeply unsettling. Soldiers who would not retreat, who would not surrender, who kept fighting until they were killed, were dangerous opponents who could not be counted on to break no matter how much pressure was applied. By the end of 1914, the German army had learned several important lessons about the British soldier. First, he could shoot. British marksmanship was, on average, superior to that of German conscripts, and in the early battles this had proven decisive. Second, he was disciplined. British soldiers followed orders, maintained formation under fire, and could conduct complex tactical movements even under extreme stress. Third, he was determined. The British soldier did not panic easily, did not break and run when the situation turned against him, and could be relied upon to hold his ground even in desperate circumstances. But German soldiers also noted what they perceived as British weaknesses. British tactics seemed unimaginative, relying heavily on firepower and defensive positions rather than maneuver and initiative. British attacks, when they came, were often frontal assaults that played to German defensive strengths. The small size of the BEF meant that British forces were always outnumbered, always at risk of being outflanked or enveloped. And British logistics, operating across the Channel, seemed vulnerable to disruption. As 1915 dawned and the war settled into the stalemate of trench warfare, both armies began to adapt to the new reality. The German army, which had expected a war of movement decided by decisive battles, found itself instead locked in a grinding war of attrition. The British Army, which had lost most of its professional soldiers in the fighting of 1914, began expanding with volunteers and conscripts who would need to learn the lessons their predecessors had paid for in blood. The battles of 1915 along the Western Front did little to change German opinions of British soldiers. At Neuve Chapelle in March, the British launched a limited offensive that achieved initial surprise and broke through German trenches. For a brief moment, it seemed the deadlock might be broken, but inadequate artillery support and poor communication meant the advance soon stalled, allowing German reserves to seal the breach. German defenders noted that the British attack had been well planned and executed with skill, but lacked the reserves and logistical support to exploit success. At the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, the Germans used poison gas for the first time on the Western Front. The chlorine cloud rolled across the lines, sending French colonial troops fleeing in terror and opening a gap in the Allied defenses. British and Canadian forces rushed to plug the breach, fighting desperately to prevent a German breakthrough. German soldiers advancing behind the gas cloud encountered British defenders who, despite being exposed to this new horror weapon, continued to resist. Men with improvised gas masks made from cloth soaked in urine fought from hastily prepared positions, firing at German infantry who expected to find only dead men and empty trenches. The battle raged for a month. The British held. German respect for British stubbornness grew. Here was an enemy who adapted quickly, who learned from setbacks, who refused to accept defeat even when new weapons and overwhelming force seemed to guarantee it. The British might not win their attacks, German officers observed, but they were proving extraordinarily difficult to defeat when defending. At Loos in September 1915, the British launched another offensive, this time using poison gas themselves. The attack achieved some initial success, capturing German trenches and advancing several miles, but once again, lack of reserves and poor coordination doomed the effort. German defenders noted that the British attack had been well planned and executed with skill, but lacked the reserves and logistical support to exploit success. By the end of 1915, both armies had spent a year locked in trench warfare that neither had anticipated and neither knew how to win. German soldiers who faced the British had developed a complex picture of their opponents. The British Tommy, as he was called by friend and foe alike, was brave, disciplined, and well-trained. He could shoot straight, dig in quickly, and hold ground tenaciously. But he seemed to lack imagination, to be bound by regulations and orders in ways that limited his effectiveness. He fought well on the defense, but struggled on the attack. He was, in short, a formidable opponent in some circumstances and a manageable one in others. What German soldiers in 1915 could not yet fully appreciate was the transformation occurring in the British Army. The small professional force that had crossed the Channel in 1914 was gone, its survivors spread thinly among the new divisions being formed from volunteers. These new army divisions lacked the experience of their predecessors, but they brought fresh enthusiasm and, crucially, vast new numbers. The British Empire was mobilizing. Divisions from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India were arriving on the Western Front. The British Army of 1916 would be vastly larger than that of 1914, and it would bring with it industrial resources that would reshape the entire character of the war. The German soldiers who had fought at Mons and Ypres knew they faced a dangerous enemy. What they did not yet know was that the British Army they would encounter in 1916 would be something unprecedented in British history. The British were preparing to launch the largest offensive in their military history, an operation that would commit over 1 million men and consume unprecedented amounts of ammunition and material. The Battle of the Somme would forever change how Germans viewed the British soldier. It would demonstrate British courage, British determination, and, most ominously for Germany, British industrial power on a scale that made previous battles seem like skirmishes. The morning of July 1st, 1916, dawned clear and bright over the rolling hills of northern France. For the preceding week, British and French artillery had pounded German positions along a 30-kilometer front, firing over 1.5 million shells in what was intended to be a methodical destruction of German defenses. The noise was continuous, overwhelming, a drumming roar that could be heard in London, 200 miles away. German soldiers huddled in their deep dugouts, some excavated 40 feet below ground, waiting for the bombardment to end and the inevitable infantry assault to begin. Those German soldiers, veteran professionals and younger conscripts alike, had good reason for confidence as that week of shelling finally ceased at 7:28 in the morning. Yes, the British bombardment had been massive. Yes, trenches had been obliterated and sections of barbed wire destroyed. But the German defensive system along the Somme was among the most sophisticated on the Western Front. First and second lines of trenches were backed by a third line under construction. Villages along the front had been converted into fortresses. Machine gun positions had been carefully sited to provide overlapping fields of fire. And most critically, those deep dugouts had protected the defenders and their weapons from even the heaviest shells. As British whistles blew at 7:30 and the first waves of infantry climbed out of their trenches and began walking across no man's land, German defenders scrambled up from their dugouts, dragging their machine guns to prepared firing positions. They reached those positions with shocking speed, often within 1 or 2 minutes of the barrage lifting. The rails some dugouts had installed allowed machine guns to be quickly pulled to the surface, and then the Germans opened fire. What happened next became one of the most tragic episodes in British military history. Wave after wave of British infantry, heavily laden with equipment, advanced at walking pace across open ground swept by machine gun fire. German defenders, far from being destroyed by the preliminary bombardment, manned their weapons and fired into the British ranks with devastating effect. In some sectors, entire battalions were cut down before reaching the German wire. Men fell in rows. Officers leading from the front were shot down. Soldiers who made it to the wire found it largely intact, forcing them to bunch up in killing zones as they tried to cut through. A German machine gunner with the 99th Reserve Infantry Regiment near Aveliers described the scene through his gun sights. "The British came on in lines," he wrote, walking slowly forward as if on parade. His gun crew had survived the bombardment in their dugout, though shells had buried some of the exits. When they finally climbed to the surface with their machine gun, the British were already halfway across no man's land. He set up the gun, aimed at the approaching lines, and opened fire. Through the smoke, he saw British soldiers falling, dozens, scores of them. He traversed the gun left and right, fired until the barrel began to glow, paused only to let his loader change the ammunition belt and cool the barrel with water. And still, the British kept coming. What struck him, what struck many German defenders that day, was the courage it took to continue advancing into such fire. The British did not break and run. They did not dive for cover and refuse to move forward. They walked into machine gun fire that was mowing them down in heaps, and they kept walking. Even when it became obvious the attack was failing, even when the dead were piled in rows and the wounded lay screaming in no man's land, fresh waves of British soldiers climbed from their trenches and advanced. By nightfall on July 1st, the British had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including nearly 20,000 dead. It was and remains the worst single day in British military history. In some sectors, battalions that had attacked with 800 men reported back with fewer than 100. The Newfoundland Regiment lost 91% of its strength in less than an hour. Entire communities back in Britain would soon find themselves mourning whole generations of young men who had volunteered together, trained together, and died together. And yet, terrible as it was, July 1st was only the beginning. The Battle of the Somme would rage for 4.5 months. The British would attack again and again, learning from failures, adapting tactics, bringing forward new technology, and slowly, painfully, at hideous cost, they would push the Germans back. German soldiers who survived the opening day of the Somme wrote home about what they had witnessed. Their letters often expressed respect, even awe at British courage. These were not the soft civilians the propaganda had described. These were men who walked into certain death without flinching. But the German letters also expressed confusion. Why did the British attack like that? Why did they advance in such dense formations, making themselves easy targets? Why did they not adapt their tactics when it was clear the first attacks were failing? What German defenders on July 1st did not yet fully understand was that they were witnessing the British Army in transition. Many of the units attacking that day were new army divisions, volunteers who had enlisted in 1914 and 15, but who had only recently arrived in France. Their training had been rushed, their experience minimal. British commanders, uncertain of how these inexperienced troops would perform in complex operations, had ordered them to advance at walking pace in neat lines, maintaining formation so officers could control them. It was a decision that cost lives, but reflected the reality that the British Army of 1916 was not the professional force of 1914. As the battle continued through July and into August, German perspectives began to shift. The initial sense of triumph at repulsing the first attacks gave way to growing concern as the British kept coming. Day after day, the bombardments resumed, the attacks continued, the pressure never relented. German divisions rotated into the Somme sector for what was supposed to be brief tours of frontline duty, found themselves locked in continuous combat. Casualties mounted. The pristine defensive systems began to break down under the weight of constant British artillery fire and repeated infantry assaults. General Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, had believed the British attack would be defeated quickly, allowing him to resume offensive operations elsewhere. Instead, he found himself feeding division after division into the Somme battle just to hold the line. By late July, German reserves that had been earmarked for operations on other fronts were being diverted to the Somme. The battle was consuming the German army's strategic reserve, gobbling up units as quickly as they could be sent forward. German soldiers began to speak of the Materialschlacht, the battle of material. British firepower was unlike anything they had encountered before. The bombardments, which continued throughout the battle, delivered more shells in a day than Germany had fired in entire campaigns. British guns, once they zeroed in on a position, would pound it for hours, reducing trenches to moonscapes, obliterating strong points, making movement above ground suicidal. German infantry huddled in their dugouts during these bombardments, knowing that when the shelling stopped, they would have to scramble to the surface and man their positions before the British infantry arrived. But with each bombardment, fewer Germans survived to make that climb.
By August, German tactics were evolving in response to British pressure. Instead of trying to hold every yard of the first-line trenches, Germans began implementing a defense in depth, with lightly held forward positions backed by strong points further back.
When British attacks broke through the first line, they found themselves facing counterattacks from fresh German reserves who had been sheltered from the preliminary bombardment. This new system, which would become standard German defensive doctrine, emerged directly from the experience of fighting the British on the Somme. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, commanding the German forces in the Somme sector, wrote in his diary about the British attacks. He noted the British soldiers showed remarkable courage, advancing again and again despite horrific casualties, but he also noted the British tactics seemed to be improving. The later attacks were better coordinated, with artillery and infantry working more closely together. The British were learning, adapting, becoming more dangerous, and they showed no sign of stopping. September brought the first appearance of British tanks on the battlefield. On September 15th, 49 Mark I tanks rumbled forward in support of British infantry attacking near Flers-Courcelette. The appearance of these strange new weapons caused panic in some German units. Soldiers who had never seen a tank before found themselves facing what looked like armored monsters that could cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and shrug off rifle fire. Some Germans fled, others stood and fought, discovering that while tanks were frightening, they were also slow, mechanically unreliable, and vulnerable to artillery fire. A German officer captured after the September 15th attacks described his first encounter with tanks. His unit had been holding a trench when they saw the British advancing behind these bizarre metal vehicles. His men opened fire with their rifles and machine guns, but the bullets simply bounced off. The tanks kept coming, rolling over their trenches, crushing the parapet, firing their weapons into the defenders. Men ran in panic. The officer tried to rally them but found himself alone in the trench, the tank passing over his head, the weight of it collapsing sections of the trench. He survived only because the tank moved past before the trench fully caved in. Scrambling out, he found his position overrun, his men scattered or captured. The British infantry had followed the tanks and were consolidating the captured ground. The tank attacks of September 1916 were not decisive. Too few tanks were available, they broke down frequently, and German defenders quickly learned that artillery could destroy them. But the psychological impact was real. German soldiers now had to consider the possibility that British attacks might come with armored support that could simply drive through their defenses. The technological superiority that Germany had enjoyed in some areas, like poison gas and flamethrowers, was now being challenged by British innovations. As autumn turned to winter and the Battle of the Somme finally wound down in November, both sides took stock of what had occurred. The British had advanced roughly 7 miles at the cost of over 400,000 casualties. The French, who had been fighting in the southern portion of the battlefield, had suffered another 200,000 casualties. German losses were estimated between 450,000 and 600,000, including many experienced officers and NCOs who could not easily be replaced. The battle had not achieved a breakthrough. The German line, though pushed back, had not broken. But the Somme had changed German perceptions of the British Army in fundamental ways. Before the battle, German soldiers had respected British courage and professionalism, but had not feared British offensive capabilities. After the Somme, they knew that the British could sustain major operations over months, could absorb horrific casualties and continue attacking, could bring to bear firepower that simply buried defenders in high explosives and steel. German soldiers writing about the Somme in the years after the war often focused on the relentlessness of the British attacks. Erich Ludendorff, who would later become first quartermaster general and effectively command the German army, wrote in his memoirs that the Somme marked a turning point. The German army, he said, was never the same after the Somme. The casualties suffered, the exhaustion from months of constant combat, the psychological strain of enduring bombardments and attacks that seemed to never end, all took a toll that Germany could not fully recover from. A passage from the history of the 27th German Division fighting on the Somme described the terror of holding the line during a British bombardment. The ground shook continuously. Men went deaf from the noise. Dugouts collapsed, burying their occupants. The air filled with dust and smoke so thick that visibility dropped to just a few yards. Supplies could not be brought forward. Wounded could not be evacuated. Relief troops could not reach the front. Soldiers sat in the darkness, hour after hour, waiting either for the shelling to end or for a direct hit that would kill them all. When the shelling finally stopped and they climbed to their positions, they found their trenches destroyed, their wire cut, and British infantry already advancing towards them. Yet, despite everything the British threw at them, German defenders on the Somme hold their ground more often than not. The German army's tactical skill, its well-developed defensive doctrine, and the determination of its soldiers proved capable of absorbing punishment that would have shattered less capable forces. But the cost was enormous, and German officers recognized that if the British could sustain this kind of offensive indefinitely, simply wearing down the German army through attrition, the eventual outcome was inevitable. British soldiers might die in terrible numbers when attacking German positions, but Germany could not replace its losses as easily as Britain could. The British Empire had vast reserves of manpower. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, all were contributing divisions to the Western Front. British industry was producing shells, guns, and equipment in quantities that Germany could not match. Time, German officers realized, was on the British side. If the war became a test of which nation could endure more losses, Britain would win eventually. The only hope was to end the war before British material superiority became overwhelming. The Somme taught German soldiers that British tenacity, that quality Wilhelm had noted in 1916, was not just an individual characteristic, but a national one. The British would not quit. They would not accept a negotiated peace that left Germany in a strong position. They would keep fighting, keep attacking, keep sending their young men forward into the guns, until either Germany collapsed or they did. And after the Somme, German soldiers increasingly suspected which outcome was more likely.
In the dugouts and trenches along the Western Front, in the barracks and hospitals behind the lines, German soldiers had a name for their British opponents. They called them Tommy, or sometimes Tommy Adkins, or simply the Tommies. The name came from a generic placeholder name used on British Army forms, but it had taken on a life of its own. When German sentries heard sounds in no man's land and wanted to verify if British soldiers were nearby, they would sometimes call out, "Tommy!" A reply, or the sudden silence that followed, would confirm their suspicions. But Tommy was more than just a name. It represented German soldiers' conception of the British soldier as a type, a character with consistent traits that could be recognized and predicted. Understanding what Germans meant when they said Tommy reveals much about how they perceive their British opponents at the individual level, stripped of strategic considerations and national stereotypes. This was not the British Empire or British policy or British High Command. This was the man across the wire, the soldier in the enemy trench, the individual opponent who might kill you tomorrow or whom you might kill today. The fundamental characteristic Germans attributed to Tommy was steadiness. British soldiers, German observers noted, did not panic easily. Under fire, they maintained discipline and continued to follow orders, even in circumstances that would break less well-trained troops. This steadiness manifested in small ways that German soldiers could observe and respect. A British sentry would remain at his post even during artillery bombardments. British working parties repairing trenches would continue their work despite sniper fire. British soldiers moving through the trenches maintained proper spacing and took sensible precautions, neither clustering dangerously close together nor spreading so far apart that control was lost. This quality of steadiness made the British soldier an ideal defender. When German attacks went forward against British positions, they rarely found the British trenches abandoned. The British would stay and fight, even when outflanked or outnumbered. German after-action reports frequently noted that British defensive positions had to be taken by assault, that the defenders had to be killed or captured rather than driven off. Battles that German planners expected to last hours often took days because British soldiers simply would not leave their positions without orders to do so. But steadiness had its limitations. German soldiers observed that Tommy seemed to lack initiative when operating independently. British soldiers followed orders well, but appeared uncomfortable making decisions when separated from their officers or NCOs. Small groups of British soldiers who became separated from their units often surrendered or withdrew, rather than continuing to fight independently. In contrast, German doctrine emphasized initiative at all levels, training even junior soldiers to assess situations and act without waiting for orders. Ernst Jünger, whose memoir Storm of Steel provides one of the most detailed German accounts of the Western Front, encountered British soldiers frequently during his years in the trenches. His descriptions of them are notable for their matter-of-fact respect.
Jünger wrote of one firefight where he watched a British soldier fire carefully aimed shots from behind a barricade, pausing to reload and aim before each shot, showing no sign of panic even as German fire converged on his position. The British soldier, Jünger noted, fought like a professional doing his job, methodical and steady rather than emotional or impulsive. In another passage, Jünger described a trench raid where his stormtroop unit attacked a British position at night. The British defenders, surprised in their dugouts, fought back immediately despite having just been woken up. Some fought with rifles, others with pistols, some with improvised clubs and entrenching tools. The fight was short and brutal, ending when the surviving British soldiers surrendered. What impressed Jünger was not the fighting itself, but the fact that even in the chaos of a night raid, the British maintained enough presence of mind to form a defensive perimeter and cover each other while withdrawing into the deeper parts of their trench system. They had been surprised, overwhelmed, and beaten, but even in defeat they had remained organized. German soldiers noted that Tommy took care of his equipment. British rifles were generally clean and well-maintained. Uniforms, though often muddied and worn, were kept in serviceable condition. British trenches, when captured, typically revealed careful organization of supplies and ammunition. This attention to detail suggested a professional approach to soldiering that German veterans could appreciate. An army whose soldiers kept their weapons clean was an army that was serious about fighting. The British soldiers' shooting ability received consistent mention in German accounts. British marksmanship training emphasized accuracy over volume of fire, training soldiers to aim carefully and fire precisely, rather than simply spraying bullets in the general direction of the enemy. German soldiers advancing across open ground frequently found themselves under fire from British riflemen who hit with disturbing regularity. Snipers were particularly dangerous. British sniper teams, often equipped with scoped rifles and working from carefully constructed hides, killed German soldiers from ranges where return fire was ineffective. But German soldiers also noted what they perceived as Tommy's conservatism in combat. British attacks followed predictable patterns: artillery bombardment, followed by infantry advance, followed by consolidation of captured positions. There was rarely anything surprising or innovative about British tactics at the small unit level. German veterans learned to anticipate what the British would do and prepare accordingly. If the artillery bombardment lifted, the infantry attack would begin within minutes. If British soldiers captured a position, they would immediately begin digging in rather than pushing forward to exploit success. This predictability made the British easier to defend against, if it did not make them any less dangerous. Interactions between German and British soldiers during quiet periods revealed interesting attitudes on both sides. Unofficial truces where soldiers in opposing trenches would silently agree not to fire during certain hours, particularly around mealtimes, were common. German soldiers observed that the British generally respected these informal arrangements. If the Germans held their fire during British mealtimes, the British would reciprocate during German mealtimes. This mutual restraint suggested that both sides saw each other as fellow soldiers trapped in an ugly situation, rather than as inhuman enemies deserving of no mercy. Christmas 1914 saw the famous Christmas Truce, where British and German soldiers left their trenches, met in no man's land, exchanged gifts and greetings, and even played impromptu football matches. This fraternization occurred more extensively between British and German units than between French and German units, suggesting that British and German soldiers found it easier to see each other as something other than purely enemies. In subsequent years, high commands on both sides strictly forbade such truces, recognizing that soldiers who socialized with the enemy might become less willing to kill that enemy when ordered to attack.
German soldiers sometimes captured British equipment and found it well-made and practical. British steel helmets, introduced in 1916, were effective at protecting against shrapnel. British rifles, particularly the Lee Enfield, were reliable and accurate. British gas masks improved rapidly as the war progressed, eventually surpassing German designs in comfort and effectiveness. This technical competence in equipment design and manufacture suggested a nation that took warfare seriously and invested in properly equipping its soldiers. The British soldiers' diet was another point of observation. When German troops overran British positions and captured stores of British rations, they found food that was generally superior to their own.
British soldiers received regular supplies of tea, tinned meat, bread, and biscuits. The famous British tea break, where soldiers would boil water for tea even under fire, became something of a joke among German soldiers, but it also reflected the British Army's attention to keeping its soldiers fed and supplied. In contrast, by late 1916 and throughout 1917, German rations were declining in both quality and quantity as the British naval blockade took effect. German soldiers noticed that British soldiers received mail from home regularly and seemed to maintain stronger connections with civilian life. British officers were visible in the trenches, sharing the dangers with their men rather than remaining safely in the rear. British medical services evacuated wounded quickly, suggesting a system that valued the lives of individual soldiers. All of this contributed to German perceptions that Tommy, while perhaps not as individually aggressive or tactically innovative as the German soldier, was a solid, dependable fighter who could be relied upon to do his duty under all circumstances. The relationship between British soldiers and their officers fascinated German observers. British officers came from a different class than their men, products of public schools and often from wealthy families. Yet in the trenches, these officers shared the dangers of their men, led from the front in attacks, and died in proportion to or even higher than the enlisted ranks. German soldiers, whose own officer class also came from distinct social backgrounds, noted with respect that British officers did not ask their men to do anything they were not willing to do themselves. When British attacks went forward, the officers were in front, waving pistols or walking sticks, making themselves obvious targets. Many died in the first minutes of attacks, shot down by German machine gunners who recognized that killing the officers would help break up the attack. This combination of class distinction and shared danger created a British military culture that German soldiers found simultaneously foreign and admirable. German officers also led from the front and shared dangers with their men, but the German army system emphasized technical expertise and tactical skill in its officers. British officers seemed to emphasize character, courage, and example. A British lieutenant might not be the best tactician, but he would be the first over the parapet when the attack began. Tommy's relationship with death was another point of observation. German soldiers noted that British soldiers seemed fatalistic about their survival chances, but not paralyzed by fear. They would joke about death, make light of dangers, maintain black humor in the face of constant mortality. This attitude helped British units maintain morale even in terrible conditions. Rather than dwelling on their losses or becoming demoralized by the death of comrades, British soldiers would bury their dead, mourn briefly, and then continue with the business of war. In prisoner interrogations, German intelligence officers found British soldiers generally willing to provide basic information like name, rank, and unit, but resistant to providing more detailed intelligence. British soldiers had been trained in what to say if captured, and most stuck to that training. They were neither defiant nor cooperative, simply professional. German interrogators noted that British prisoners generally expected fair treatment and were surprised by any mistreatment they encountered. This suggested British soldiers had been told that Germans would respect the rules of warfare, a belief that was generally validated by their treatment in German prisoner of war camps. By 1917 and 1918, as the war ground on and both armies became exhausted, German perceptions of Tommy began to include grudging acknowledgement of his endurance. The British Army of late 1917, battered by 3 years of combat, decimated at battles like Passchendaele, depleted by losses that had consumed entire generations of young men, still held the line. Tommy was still in the trenches, still attacking when ordered to attack, still defending when required to defend. German soldiers, themselves exhausted and demoralized by years of war, recognized in their British opponents the same weary determination they felt themselves. The British soldier, as Germans saw him, was not a brilliant tactical innovator or an aggressive warrior. He was not going to win the war through individual courage or initiative, but he was going to hold his ground, follow his orders, and keep fighting until someone told him to stop. He represented the British national character as German soldiers understood it: steady, disciplined, conservative, but utterly determined. Tommy might not be the most dangerous opponent on the battlefield, but he was one of the most reliable. You could predict what he would do, but you could not make him quit, and in a war of attrition, that quality might prove decisive. Among the many German soldiers who fought on the Western Front, few left such a detailed record of their experiences as Ernst Jünger. His memoir, Storm of Steel, published in 1920, provides an unparalleled window into how a thoughtful, educated German officer perceived the war and those fighting in it. Jünger's account is particularly valuable because he fought primarily against British forces and recorded his impressions of them with the eye of both a soldier and a writer. Jünger joined the German army in 1914 as a young volunteer, barely 19 years old. By the time the war ended 4 years later, he had been wounded 14 times, including 5 bullet wounds, and had earned the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military decoration. He spent virtually the entire war on the Western Front, often in the most dangerous sectors, frequently serving in stormtroop units that specialized in raids and assaults. This extensive combat experience gave him countless opportunities to observe British soldiers, both at a distance and at extremely close range. What makes Jünger's perspective unique is his attitude toward the enemy. Unlike many war memoirs that demonize the opposition or depict them as less than human, Jünger wrote about British soldiers with respect and even admiration. He did not hate them. He did not question their courage or mock their abilities. Instead, he treated them as worthy opponents, professionals who deserved recognition for their skill and determination even as he tried to kill them. Jünger's description of combat against British forces emphasizes the professionalism he encountered. In one passage, he describes a British counterattack that drove his unit out of a captured position. The British did not charge wildly or rely on superior numbers. Instead, they advanced with covering fire, used smoke to obscure their movements, and maintained formation even under German fire. When they reached the German position, they cleared it methodically, room by room in the case of captured buildings, bay by bay in captured trenches. This tactical competence, Jünger noted, made British counterattacks particularly dangerous because they were difficult to disrupt or deflect. In another section of his memoir, Jünger recounts a raid his stormtroop conducted on British trenches near Combles during the Battle of the Somme. His unit crept across no man's land at night, cut through the British wire, and entered the enemy trench system. The British defenders, alerted by the wire cutting, had prepared an ambush. As Jünger's men entered the trench, British soldiers opened fire from positions in the traverse bays. A vicious close-quarters battle followed, fought with grenades, pistols, and entrenching tools. Jünger himself shot a British soldier who charged at him from around a corner, so close that he could see the man's face clearly in the light of a flare. What struck Jünger about this encounter was not the violence, which he described matter-of-factly, but the British soldiers' response to being surprised. They had not panicked or tried to flee. Instead, they had organized a defense, designated firing positions, and contested every yard of trench. Even when the raid succeeded and Jünger's unit captured several prisoners, the remaining British defenders continued to resist from further down the trench line, forcing the Germans to withdraw with their prisoners rather than penetrate deeper into the British position. Jünger wrote about killing British soldiers with a disturbing casualness that shocked some readers when the book was published. He described shooting enemy soldiers as one might describe any other aspect of combat operations, without remorse or glorification. This detached perspective extended to his descriptions of hand-to-hand combat, where he killed British soldiers at extremely close range. In one passage, he recounts stabbing a British soldier during a trench raid, watching the man fall, and then immediately moving on to engage the next opponent. The British soldier became simply the enemy, a threat to be neutralized rather than a person to be considered. Yet this same detachment allowed Jünger to observe British soldiers objectively. He noted their equipment, their tactics, their morale, their behavior under fire. He recorded details that other memoirists might have overlooked. British soldiers, he wrote, tended to maintain cleaner trenches than French soldiers, but not as clean as German trenches. They were more likely to hold their positions when attacked, but less likely to launch counterattacks when an opportunity presented itself. They used grenades effectively, but seemed less comfortable with the close-quarters combat that characterized trench raids.
Junger's depiction of British officers was particularly nuanced. He observed that British officers led from the front, making themselves obvious targets. He wrote about watching British attacks where officers walked ahead of their men, often unarmed except for pistols or swagger sticks, presenting themselves as examples of courage for their troops to follow. This leadership style impressed Jünger, who noted that German officers also led from the front, but typically carried rifles and tried to blend in with their men rather than standing out visually.
In one memorable passage, Jünger describes observing a British officer through binoculars during a quiet period. The officer was supervising the repair of damaged trenches, walking openly along the parapet despite being exposed to German observation. Jünger could have ordered a sniper to shoot the officer, but chose not to, reasoning that the officer's courage and dedication to his duties deserved respect. This incident, which Jünger presents without sentimentality, reveals his personal code of honor. British officers who led from the front and shared dangers with their men earned Jünger's respect, even as he prepared to kill them if required. Storm of Steel contains several descriptions of British prisoners. Jünger wrote that British soldiers who were captured typically maintained their composure, answering basic questions but providing minimal information. They expected fair treatment and generally received it, though Jünger notes exceptions where the chaos of battle led to prisoners being shot by soldiers too focused on immediate threats to bother with captives. The British prisoners Jünger encountered seemed fatalistic about their capture, neither devastated nor relieved, simply accepting their situation as one more aspect of a war they could not control. The book also documents the evolution of the Western Front battlefield and the British Army's adaptation to trench warfare. Jünger fought at the Somme in 1916, at Arras in 1917, at Passchendaele later that year, and during the German Spring Offensive of 1918. Across these battles, he observed British tactics improving. The British of 1918, he wrote, were far more dangerous opponents than the British of 1916. They used artillery more effectively, coordinated infantry and artillery better, employed more flexible tactics that allowed for initiative at the small unit level, and demonstrated better combined arms capabilities when tanks were available. Jünger's descriptions of British artillery fire reveal the psychological impact of the firepower Britain brought to bear. He wrote about enduring British bombardments that lasted for hours, reducing trenches to muddy craters and burying soldiers alive when dugouts collapsed. The sound alone was enough to drive men mad, he noted. The constant screaming of incoming shells, the explosions that shook the ground and made breathing difficult, the uncertainty of when or where the next shell would land. British artillery tactics evolved from crude area bombardments to sophisticated barrages that could isolate sections of the German line, prevent reinforcement, and prepare the ground for infantry assault. Yet, despite documenting British improvements, Jünger noted what he saw as limitations. British attacks, even late in the war, seemed to lack the flexibility and aggression of German defensive tactics. British units that captured positions would dig in and call for reinforcement rather than pushing forward to exploit success. British units that captured positions would dig in and call for reinforcement rather than continuing the advance. This methodical approach, while reducing casualties and maintaining control, often allowed German forces to prepare counterattacks and recover lost ground. Jünger's perspective on British soldiers was informed by his broader philosophy about warfare and life. He saw combat as a test of individual character, a crucible that revealed a man's true nature. By this standard, British soldiers measured up well. They demonstrated courage under fire, maintained discipline under extreme stress, and could be relied upon to do their duty even in terrible circumstances. Jünger did not love them or feel camaraderie with them, but he respected them as fellow warriors caught in the same brutal experience. The question of whether Jünger's memoir is an anti-war book or a pro-war book has been debated since its publication. Jünger himself insisted he was simply recording his experiences without moral judgment. He described the war as it was, without editorializing about whether it should have been fought or celebrating its conduct. This ambiguity has made Storm of Steel controversial, but it also makes it valuable as a source.
Jünger had no agenda to portray British soldiers as either demons or heroes. He simply described them as he encountered them, professional soldiers doing their jobs in circumstances that tested the limits of human endurance. Jünger's descriptions of the end of the war, when German forces finally began to collapse in late 1918, reveal his assessment of why Germany lost. It was not, he argued, because British soldiers were better fighters. German soldiers, Jünger believed, were equal or superior to their British opponents in training, courage, and tactical skill. Germany lost because Britain could sustain losses and replace them while Germany could not, because British material resources dwarfed German resources, and because the British would not accept any outcome except total German defeat. The British soldiers' determination, that stubborn refusal to quit that Jünger had observed throughout the war, ultimately proved decisive. Storm of Steel influenced how Germans remembered the war and how they thought about their enemies. Jünger's respect for British soldiers, his acknowledgement of their courage and professionalism, helped create a narrative where German defeat was not shameful, but rather the inevitable result of being outnumbered and outproduced. If the British were worthy opponents who fought with determination and skill, then German soldiers could claim honor in having fought them to a standstill for 4 years. This narrative would prove important in the interwar period and would shape how German veterans approached the next conflict with Britain.
When German soldiers spoke of fighting the British, they often failed to distinguish between soldiers from Britain itself and soldiers from the dominions and colonies of the British Empire. But those who faced Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, or Indian troops quickly learned that fighting Commonwealth forces was a distinctly different experience from fighting British regulars. These colonial soldiers earned reputations among German troops that ranged from grudging respect to genuine fear. The Canadians arrived on the Western Front in 1915 and immediately made an impression. At the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, Canadian divisions held the line when French colonial troops fled from the first German gas attacks. Canadian soldiers, many of them recent immigrants who had volunteered to fight for their adopted homeland, stood their ground despite having minimal protection against the chlorine gas. They improvised gas masks from cloth soaked in urine and held positions that prevented a German breakthrough. German soldiers who fought against Canadians at Ypres encountered opponents who simply would not retreat, even when exposed to a weapon that caused men to suffocate in agony. But it was in the battles of 1916 and 1917 that Canadian forces earned their fearsome reputation among German troops. Canadians specialized in trench raids, developing tactics and techniques that made them the most accomplished raiders on the Western Front. These raids were not the large-scale attacks that characterized most Western Front operations. Instead, they were carefully planned operations where small groups of soldiers would infiltrate German trenches at night, kill or capture defenders, gather intelligence, and withdraw before German reinforcements arrived. German soldiers stationed in trenches opposite Canadian units lived in constant fear of night raids. The Canadians moved silently, striking without warning in the darkness. They used clubs, knives, and sharpened entrenching tools rather than firearms, killing silently to avoid alerting nearby German positions. They were ruthless, efficient, and showed little mercy to defenders who resisted. German soldiers captured during these raids often reported that their comrades had been killed with shocking brutality, clubbed or stabbed to death in their dugouts before they even understood they were under attack. A German soldier who had been captured during a Canadian trench raid recalled that he was beaten by a Canadian colonel after being taken prisoner. The colonel, through an interpreter, told him he had no use for prisoners from units that killed Canadian wounded. Whether this accusation was true or not, it reflected the intensity of the fighting between Canadian and German forces. Canadian soldiers, German prisoners reported, took fewer prisoners than British regulars and showed less restraint when dealing with captured enemies. Historians have debated why Canadians developed such a reputation for ferocity. Some point to the crucified Canadian story, a wartime rumor that German soldiers had crucified a Canadian soldier. Though this story was almost certainly false, it circulated widely among Canadian troops and may have influenced their behavior toward German prisoners.
Others note that Canadian forces suffered heavily from German gas attacks at Ypres, creating a desire for revenge. Still others argue that Canadians, as soldiers from a younger and rougher society, simply approached warfare with less restraint than their British counterparts. Whatever the explanation, German soldiers learned to fear Canadian divisions. Intelligence reports identifying Canadian units in a sector would lead to increased vigilance and reinforcement of defenses. German officers warned their troops that Canadians did not take many prisoners and advised soldiers to fight rather than attempt to surrender if captured by Canadian forces. This fear was not groundless. Research into Canadian operations has revealed instances where Canadian soldiers executed German prisoners, sometimes in the heat of battle when taking prisoners was difficult, sometimes as revenge for previous German actions, sometimes simply because they did not want to bother with captives. The Australian forces that arrived in France in 1916 brought a different but equally formidable reputation. Australians came from a frontier society, many of them from rural backgrounds where self-reliance and initiative were valued. They had already fought at Gallipoli, earning a reputation for courage and aggression in that disastrous campaign. When they reached the Western Front, they proved to be exceptional fighters who combined British discipline with a distinctly Australian irreverence for authority. German soldiers who faced Australians in battle noted several distinctive characteristics. Australians were aggressive in the attack, often continuing to advance even after British units on their flanks had been stopped. They were skilled at infiltration tactics, using terrain effectively and approaching German positions with stealth before launching sudden assaults. And they showed remarkable initiative, with junior officers and even enlisted men making tactical decisions that German doctrine reserved for more senior commanders. A German letter, translated by Australian intelligence in May 1918, described Australian soldiers as cunning and quick. The letter writer, stationed opposite Australian positions near Albert, complained that Australians crept up to German trenches at night like cats, so silently that sentries did not hear them until it was too late. Australian night raids, like Canadian raids, terrified German defenders, who never knew when or where the next attack would come.
But Australians also earned German respect for their fighting ability in set-piece battles. At Pozières during the Somme campaign, at Polygon Wood during 3rd Ypres, at Hamel and Amiens in 1918, Australian forces demonstrated that they could plan and execute complex operations with skill that matched or exceeded British regular divisions. German after-action reports noted that Australian attacks were typically well coordinated, with artillery and infantry working closely together. Australian soldiers advanced with determination, but also with tactical flexibility, adapting to changing circumstances rather than rigidly following predetermined plans. The relationship between Australian soldiers and their officers was different from the British model and fascinated German observers. Australian officers led from the front like British officers, but the social distance between officers and enlisted men seemed smaller. Australians called their officers by first names in some circumstances, argued with orders they disagreed with, and showed a casual disregard for military formality that would have been unthinkable in the British or German armies. Yet this informality did not seem to undermine effectiveness. Australian units maintained discipline when it mattered, in combat, even if they were relaxed about saluting and military courtesy in rear areas. German intelligence reports on Commonwealth forces noted that Canadians and Australians seemed to enjoy better rations than British regulars, were better paid, and maintained higher morale even late in the war. These colonial soldiers received packages from home, had access to recreation facilities behind the lines, and generally lived better than either British or German soldiers. This material advantage, combined with their combat effectiveness, made Commonwealth divisions particularly valuable. British commanders often used Canadian and Australian forces as shock troops, assigning them to difficult objectives that required skill and determination to capture. New Zealand forces, though smaller in number, earned similar respect from German opponents.
The New Zealand division fought at Passchendaele, where they suffered terrible casualties but captured objectives that other divisions had failed to take. German defenders who survived New Zealand attacks reported that the soldiers fought with determination that matched the Canadians and Australians. Like the other Dominion forces, New Zealanders seemed to combine discipline with initiative, following orders while also adapting to circumstances. Indian Army divisions present a more complex picture. German soldiers encountered Indian forces primarily in 1914 and 1915, before most Indian divisions were transferred to other theaters. German reactions to Indian soldiers were colored with racist attitudes that were common in that era. Some German accounts dismiss Indian soldiers as primitive or inferior, reflecting the racist propaganda that Germans, like many Europeans of that time, produced. But more thoughtful German observers recognized that Indian soldiers, particularly Sikh and Gurkha units, were formidable opponents who fought with courage and skill. German soldiers noted that Indian troops seemed less affected by the cold and wet of the Western Front than European soldiers, an observation that was almost certainly incorrect, but reflected German attempts to explain why Indian units continued to function in conditions that degraded the effectiveness of other forces. What German soldiers failed to appreciate fully was that Indian troops were often poorly equipped for European warfare, lacking adequate cold weather gear and sometimes issued inferior weapons and equipment compared to British regulars. Despite these disadvantages, Indian forces held their positions and attacked when ordered, demonstrating the same discipline that characterized other British Empire forces. The question of whether Commonwealth forces were really more effective than British regular divisions, or whether they simply earned better reputations because they were used more selectively for important operations, cannot be definitively answered from German perspectives alone. What is clear is that German soldiers believed Commonwealth forces were more dangerous opponents. Whether this belief was based on reality or on the psychological impact of facing troops with fearsome reputations, the practical effect was the same. German units identified as facing Canadians, Australians, or New Zealanders prepared more carefully, reinforced their defenses more thoroughly, and expected harder fighting than when facing British regular divisions. By 1918, when the German Spring Offensive was finally stopped and Allied forces launched their counteroffensives, Commonwealth divisions played central roles in the victories that led to German defeat. The Canadian Corps captured Vimy Ridge and led the assault at Amiens that broke through German lines. Australian forces drove German defenders back in a series of successful attacks. New Zealand units continued to demonstrate their fighting effectiveness. These successes in the final year of the war reinforced German perceptions that Commonwealth forces represented the most dangerous elements of the British Empire's military power. German soldiers writing after the war about their experiences fighting Commonwealth forces often expressed a kind of rueful respect. Yes, Canadians and Australians were brutal in combat. Yes, they showed little mercy and took few prisoners. Yes, facing them was more dangerous than facing British regulars. But they were also fellow warriors, men who understood combat and approached it with a professionalism that German soldiers could recognize and respect. The colonial soldiers, paradoxically, seemed more like German stormtroopers than British regulars, aggressive and skilled and willing to take risks. This recognition that the British Empire's military power extended far beyond Britain itself was sobering for German strategic thinkers. Germany faced not just Britain, but Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and eventually other colonies and dominions. The manpower pool Britain could draw on was vast, potentially unlimited. Even if Germany could defeat British regular divisions, the Dominion forces kept coming. This reality, perhaps more than any other factor, convinced German leaders that the war could not be won through military victory alone. Britain had too many reserves, too much depth, too many soldiers scattered across too many countries. Defeating the British Empire in a war of attrition was impossible.
The British Army's officers' corps in both World Wars was drawn largely from a distinct social class, the products of public schools and universities, often from families with military traditions stretching back generations.
These officers, many of them quite young when they received their commissions, led British soldiers in both world wars. How did German soldiers and officers perceive this British officer class? What did they make of these educated young men who wore their ranks openly, carried swagger sticks instead of rifles, and led attacks from the front? The first thing German observers noted was that British officers made themselves obvious. In the early years of World War I, British officers wore distinctive uniforms that marked them clearly as leaders. They did not carry rifles like their men, instead carrying only pistols and sometimes walking sticks. Their uniforms had subtle but noticeable differences in cut and quality. They wore Sam Browne belts, leather straps that crossed the chest and were visible from a distance. All of this made British officers easy to identify, and therefore easy targets. German machine gunners and snipers learned to prioritize British officers. Kill the officers first, the doctrine went, and the attack would become easier to repel. British officers, aware of this targeting but constrained by their own traditions and the need to set examples for their men, continued to lead from the front despite horrific casualty rates. In some British units, officer casualties exceeded 50% in major battles. Junior officers, lieutenants, and captains leading companies and platoons died at rates even higher than their enlisted men. This willingness to face death as an example to subordinates impressed German soldiers and officers alike. German officers also led from the front and suffered high casualties, but the German army made some effort to protect its officers, training them to blend in with their men and to minimize obvious displays of rank when under fire. British officers seemed almost to embrace the danger, as if facing it openly was a point of honor. German soldiers who witnessed British attacks often noted that the first men to fall were the officers, shot down as they led their troops forward. The social class dimension of British officership fascinated German observers. British officers came from wealthy families, had attended elite schools, spoke with distinct accents that marked them as upper class, yet they willingly shared the dangers and hardships of trench warfare with their working-class soldiers. German officers also came from distinct class backgrounds, primarily from the Junker aristocracy in Prussia or from military families throughout Germany. But the social distance between German officers and enlisted men was, if anything, more pronounced than in the British Army. The German military system emphasized hierarchy and expected enlisted men to show deference to officers at all times. British officers, German observers noted, seemed to maintain class distinctions even in the trenches. Officers lived in separate quarters, ate different food, and associated primarily with each other rather than with enlisted men. But this social separation coexisted with a shared sense of duty. British officers did not send their men into danger while remaining safe themselves. They went first, and their men followed. This example of leadership by personal courage rather than by authority alone was something German officers could respect, even if they did not fully understand the social system that produced it. Post-war German memoirs sometimes criticized British generalship while praising British junior officers. The senior commanders who planned the offensives, men like Field Marshal Douglas Haig, were portrayed as incompetent aristocrats who wasted the lives of better men through rigid tactics and poor planning. But the lieutenants and captains who led the attacks, who died in no man's land trying to rally their men, were treated with respect. German veterans recognized that British junior officers were trying to execute plans they may not have believed in, showing personal courage even when serving under failed leadership. This distinction between respect for individual British officers and criticism of British high command reflected a broader German perspective on the British Army. At the tactical level, the level of platoons and companies and even battalions, British forces were professionally led and well commanded. British officers at these levels demonstrated tactical competence and personal bravery. But at higher levels, divisions and corps and armies, British command seemed rigid and unimaginative. Senior British commanders relied on overwhelming force and methodical preparation rather than maneuver and surprise. They planned set-piece battles that followed predictable patterns, making it easier for German defenders to prepare.
The German military system emphasized mission-type orders, where senior commanders specified objectives but left the means of achieving them to subordinates. Junior officers were expected to show initiative and adapt to circumstances. In contrast, British command seemed more centralized, with detailed orders specifying how objectives should be achieved. British junior officers executed these orders with courage and determination, but they seemed less willing or able to deviate from the plan when circumstances changed.
German accounts of captured British officers reveal interesting details about their character. British officers, even when captured, typically maintained their dignity and composure. They provided required information like name, rank, and unit, but generally refused to discuss operational matters. They expected to be treated according to the rules of warfare and typically were, at least in World War I. German officers who interrogated British officer prisoners often noted their education and culture. Many British officers spoke French and some spoke German, allowing for direct conversation without interpreters. These captured British officers sometimes expressed frustration with their own high command. They would acknowledge that the tactics their army employed were costly and often ineffective. They would admit that better coordination between artillery and infantry was needed, but they would also defend their duty to follow orders and lead their men as well as possible within the constraints they faced. German officers conducting these interrogations often came away with the impression that British junior officers were better than their army's system allowed them to be, that individual competence was being wasted by poor planning at higher levels. The temporary gentleman phenomenon, where working and middle-class men received emergency commissions during World War I, complicated German perceptions of British officers. These new officers lacked the social background of traditional British officers, but often brought energy and fresh perspectives. German intelligence had difficulty distinguishing between traditional and temporary officers in captured prisoners, since they wore the same uniforms and held the same ranks. But German observers did note that the British officer corps seemed to be expanding with men from diverse backgrounds, suggesting that Britain was mobilizing its full population for the war effort. In World War II, German perspectives on British officers evolved. British officers in the Second World War were still predominantly from upper and middle-class backgrounds, still products of the same school system that had produced their father's generation, but they fought differently. British officers in World War II seemed more willing to embrace mobile warfare, combined arms tactics, and flexibility in planning. The rigid set-piece battles of World War I had given way to more fluid operations in North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe. German officers who fought in North Africa against the British Eighth Army noted the competence of British junior officers. Montgomery's army employed sophisticated tactics that required initiative at the company and platoon level. British officers demonstrated that they could lead mobile operations, coordinate armor and infantry, and adapt to the fluid battlefield conditions of desert warfare. They were still recognizably British, still maintaining the same traditions of leading from the front and sharing dangers with their men, but they were also more tactically sophisticated than their World War I predecessors. The commando raids and special operations that characterized some British operations in World War II also impressed German observers. British officers leading these elite units demonstrated creativity, aggression, and skill. Raids on German-held positions in France and Norway, operations deep behind enemy lines in North Africa and the Mediterranean, all showed that British officers could plan and execute complex operations requiring initiative and flexibility. German commanders came to recognize that while British officers might be constrained by their army's overall caution, individual British officers could be formidable opponents when given freedom to operate. The relationship between British and German officers, particularly at senior levels, was marked by a strange mixture of respect and contempt. German senior officers often regarded their British counterparts as social equals, fellow professionals from similar class backgrounds.
Erwin Rommel, who fought British forces in both World Wars, reportedly respected several British commanders he faced, particularly those who showed tactical skill and personal courage. Yet German officers also believed that British generalship was inferior to German generalship, that British commanders relied on material superiority rather than tactical brilliance. This attitude reflected deeper German beliefs about the nature of warfare. German military culture emphasized the operational art, the level of command between tactics and strategy, where campaigns were planned and armies maneuvered. German officers believed they excelled at this level of warfare, that German generalship could overcome material disadvantages through superior planning and execution. British officers, German commanders believed, were competent tacticians and brave leaders, but lacked the operational brilliance that German commanders possessed. This belief persisted even as German armies were defeated in both world wars, suggesting that it reflected cultural assumptions rather than objective assessment. The British officer class, as German soldiers and officers perceived it, was a paradox. Individually brave and often competent, these officers led their men with courage that demanded respect. Collectively, as an institution, they seemed to embody everything that frustrated German strategic thinkers about fighting the British. They were bound by tradition, constrained by class systems, operating within a military culture that valued discipline and order over initiative and creativity. Yet they produced the Wellingtons and Montgomerys who eventually defeated Germany. They led armies that, for all their faults, kept fighting until Germany collapsed.
By late 1916, German soldiers on the Western Front faced a reality that would dominate the remainder of the war. The British army they were fighting was not just more numerous than it had been in 1914, it was vastly better supplied. British artillery fired more shells in a single day than Germany had expended in entire campaigns. British soldiers had food, equipment, and ammunition in quantities that German soldiers could only dream of. British industry was producing war material at rates that Germany could not match. This material superiority, more than any tactical innovation or strategic brilliance, would ultimately determine the outcome of the war. German soldiers called it the Materialschlacht, the Battle of Materiel. It was not a term of respect. It suggested that Britain was winning through sheer weight of resources rather than through skill or courage. British soldiers, German troops said with a mixture of envy and contempt, did not need to be clever or brave when they could simply bury their opponents in steel and high explosives. But however Germans characterized it, British material superiority was undeniable, and its effects were devastating. British artillery dominated the Western Front by 1917. German soldiers endured bombardments that turned the landscape into a moonscape, obliterating trenches, destroying strongpoints, making movement above ground impossible during daylight hours. These bombardments could last for hours, even days. British guns, ranging from field artillery to massive railway-mounted pieces, fired in carefully coordinated patterns designed to isolate sections of the German line, prevent reinforcement, and systematically destroy defensive positions. A German soldier describing a British bombardment wrote that the sound alone was enough to drive men mad. The screaming of incoming shells, the explosions that shook the ground and collapsed dugouts, the continuous rain of shrapnel and debris, all created an environment of sustained terror. Men huddled in dugouts, praying that the next shell would not be a direct hit. Those who survived emerged deaf, disoriented, and psychologically shattered. Shell shock, the term used then for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, affected German soldiers as much as British soldiers. But German soldiers suffered from British shells more than British soldiers suffered from German shells, simply because Britain could fire more of them. The industrial capacity that produced this artillery superiority was something German military planners had underestimated.
Britain had entered the war with a relatively small military establishment, but a massive industrial base. British factories that had produced civilian goods retooled to produce shells, guns, explosives, and equipment. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, operating machinery and filling shells in munitions plants. The British government organized production through central planning, directing resources where they were needed most. The result was an industrial mobilization that far exceeded German expectations. German intelligence reports from late 1916 onward noted the scale of British production with growing alarm. British soldiers on the Western Front were better equipped than they had been in 1914. They had adequate rifles, sufficient ammunition, proper clothing and boots, reliable gas masks, steel helmets that provided real protection against shrapnel. German soldiers, by contrast, were beginning to experience shortages. The British naval blockade was cutting off raw materials Germany needed for war production. German rations were declining in quality and quantity. Equipment was being repaired and reused rather than replaced. British logistics impressed German observers even more than British firepower. The British Army could move supplies from ports in France to the front lines with remarkable efficiency. Railways, motor transport, and even horse-drawn wagons operated in a coordinated system that kept British forces supplied even during major offensives. Captured British supply dumps revealed stockpiles of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment that dwarfed anything German units could accumulate. A British division preparing for an attack would have supplies calculated to sustain it for days or weeks. A German division launching a counterattack often had to rely on what its soldiers could carry. The introduction of tanks in 1916 demonstrated British willingness to innovate and invest in new technology. Early tanks were unreliable and vulnerable, but they represented a commitment to finding technological solutions to tactical problems. By 1918, British tanks had evolved into more reliable and effective weapons. The Mark IV and Mark V tanks that appeared in the final year of the war could crush trenches, crush barbed wire, and support infantry attacks in ways that fundamentally changed battlefield dynamics. German soldiers who encountered British tanks in 1918 found them more intimidating than the clumsy machines of 1916. These newer tanks were better armored, more reliable, and employed in larger numbers. At the Battle of Amiens in August 1918, British and Commonwealth forces attacked with over 500 tanks, a concentration of armor that overwhelmed German defenses. German anti-tank weapons, which had proven effective against earlier tank models, struggled against the improved armor of the newer British tanks. The psychological impact of facing these metal monsters, grinding forward impervious to rifle and machine gun fire, was enormous.
But it was not just tanks that demonstrated British technological and industrial superiority. British aircraft appeared in increasing numbers over the Western Front. By 1918, the Royal Air Force, newly formed from the Royal Flying Corps and Royal Naval Air Service, had over 20,000 aircraft. German soldiers on the ground grew accustomed to seeing British aircraft overhead, observing German positions, directing artillery fire, and strafing trenches. The air war, which had begun with both sides flying primitive aircraft on reconnaissance missions, had evolved into a contest for air superiority where British numbers increasingly dominated. German soldiers noticed that British soldiers received regular replacement equipment. A British soldier whose rifle was damaged or worn out would receive a new one. A British unit that lost equipment during an attack would have that equipment replaced before the next operation. German soldiers, by contrast, were expected to maintain their equipment indefinitely, repairing and improvising as necessary. By 1918, some German units were so short of rifles that not every soldier could be armed. German machine gun units reduced the number of guns per company to conserve ammunition. German artillery units conserved shells, firing only when absolutely necessary. The disparity in medical supplies and services also affected German perceptions.
British wounded were evacuated quickly through a sophisticated medical chain that moved casualties from aid posts near the front to field hospitals behind the lines to base hospitals far from the fighting. British medical services had adequate supplies of medicines, bandages, and surgical equipment. British doctors could provide care that saved lives and returned wounded soldiers to duty. German medical services, while competent, lacked the resources to match British capabilities. Wounded German soldiers often waited longer for evacuation, received less effective treatment due to shortages of medicines and supplies, and were more likely to die of wounds or infections that British medical services could have treated successfully. The food situation highlighted the material imbalance perhaps more than any other factor. British soldiers in the trenches received regular rations that included meat, bread, vegetables, tea, and even luxuries like cigarettes and chocolate. British soldiers might complain about the quality of their food, but they were never truly hungry. German soldiers by 1917, and especially 1918, were increasingly malnourished. The British naval blockade had cut off food imports to Germany. Agricultural production within Germany declined as farmers were conscripted and fertilizers became unavailable. German rations shrank to bread, ersatz coffee made from grain, and watery soup. Meat became rare. Fats and sugars disappeared from the diet. Hungry soldiers are less effective soldiers. German combat effectiveness declined in part because troops were physically weakened by inadequate nutrition. British soldiers attacking German positions in 1918 sometimes found that captured German soldiers were emaciated, showing signs of long-term malnutrition. These captured soldiers would express amazement at British rations, unable to believe that the enemy ate so well while they had been slowly starving. The cumulative effect of British material superiority wore down German combat effectiveness throughout 1917 and 18. Each British attack, even if repelled, cost the Germans equipment and supplies that could not be replaced. Each British bombardment destroyed German positions that required resources and labor to rebuild. Each month the war continued saw the British grow relatively stronger as German resources dwindled. German soldiers understood this imbalance. They knew they were fighting an enemy who could afford to waste resources, while Germany had to husband every shell, every rifle, every scrap of food. German officers attempting to plan operations in 1918 faced constraints their British counterparts did not experience. A German attack required careful accumulation of scarce ammunition, concentration of limited artillery, and reliance on achieving surprise, since German forces lacked the resources to sustain prolonged offensives. British attacks, by contrast, could rely on massive preliminary bombardments, overwhelming artillery support during the attack, and the expectation that supplies would continue flowing forward to sustain the advance. When German attacks failed, as most did in the spring offensive of 1918, the lost equipment and expended ammunition represented resources Germany could not replace. When British attacks failed, the British simply brought forward more supplies and tried again. This material disparity shaped German soldiers' perceptions of their British opponents in complicated ways. On one hand, German soldiers could take pride in their ability to fight effectively despite being outnumbered and outproduced. German tactical skill, German defensive expertise, German soldier quality remained high even as resources declined. German soldiers could claim they were better fighters than the British, that they achieved more with less, that they maintained effectiveness in circumstances that would have broken less capable armies. On the other hand, the ultimate futility of fighting against an enemy with unlimited resources could not be ignored. Being a better soldier did not matter if the enemy had 10 times as many soldiers, 100 times as many shells, infinite supplies of everything needed to continue fighting. The British material superiority that German soldiers witnessed on the Western Front would prove to be a preview of what they would face in an even more overwhelming form in World War II. The lessons of 1914 to 1918 about fighting a material superior enemy were apparently not learned by German leadership, who once again chose to fight Britain and eventually an alliance that included even greater industrial powers. But that is a story that requires its own telling.
By 1917, the war that both sides had expected to end quickly had become a grinding stalemate that seemed likely to continue indefinitely.
3 years of fighting had consumed millions of men, reshaped the landscapes of Belgium and northern France, and fundamentally changed how warfare was conducted. German soldiers who had fought since 1914 were exhausted, demoralized by losses and privations, skeptical of victory, but still determined to hold their ground. British soldiers, equally tired and disillusioned, nonetheless continued to attack, to plan new offensives, to maintain pressure on German lines. German perspectives on British forces evolved during these final 2 years of the war. The British Army of 1917 to 1918 was not the small professional force of 1914 or even the expanding volunteer army of 1915-1916. It was now a mass conscript army, with mandatory service laws having been implemented in Britain to maintain force levels despite horrific casualties. But this conscript army had learned from 3 years of combat. Its tactics had improved dramatically. Its coordination between infantry, artillery, and the new technologies of tanks and aircraft was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The Third Battle of Ypres, known to history as Passchendaele, began in July 1917 and continued through November. German soldiers defending the Ypres salient faced a nightmare of bombardments and attacks in terrain that had been turned into a swamp by rain and shellfire. British attacks ground forward through mud that could swallow men and horses, across craters filled with water, toward objectives that had been churned into featureless wastelands by months of artillery fire. German defenders at Passchendaele found themselves fighting an enemy that had adapted to trench warfare's brutal realities. British attacks now came in waves, with fresh troops passing through exhausted units to maintain pressure. British artillery tactics employed creeping barrages that moved forward in coordinated schedules, forcing German defenders to stay under cover until British infantry was almost upon them. British stormtroops, specialized assault units similar to German stormtroopers, led attacks with grenades and close combat weapons, clearing strongpoints before consolidating forces moved forward. A German machine gunner with the 238th Reserve Infantry Regiment wrote about the fighting at Passchendaele in October 1917. His company had been defending a position near Polygon Wood for 3 days. British bombardments had been continuous, with only brief respites. When the shelling stopped and British infantry advanced, his gun crew emerged from their dugout to find the landscape transformed. What had been a trench system was now a field of overlapping craters. The British came forward through the mud, using shell holes for cover, advancing in small groups rather than the neat lines of 1916. His machine gun crew fired at them, but the targets were fewer and harder to hit. British fire and movement tactics, with some soldiers advancing while others provided covering fire, made it difficult to concentrate fire effectively. The fighting degenerated into close combat in the mud. British soldiers reached the German position before being driven back by counterattacks. The machine gunners' company lost 2/3 of its strength in those 3 days. When relief finally came, the survivors were so exhausted they could barely walk to the rear. What struck him was not just the fighting's intensity, but the British persistence. They kept attacking even when gains were measured in yards, even when the mud made movement almost impossible, even when their casualties must have been as horrific as German casualties. By late 1917, German soldiers were increasingly aware that the war was turning against Germany. Russia's collapse and withdrawal from the war provided some relief on the Eastern Front, but Germany was exhausted. The British naval blockade had created food shortages that affected soldiers and civilians alike. German industrial production was declining as raw materials became scarce. Morale was deteriorating as soldiers realized that victory was impossible and the war might continue indefinitely. The Third German Spring Offensive of 1918 represented Germany's final attempt to win the war before American forces could arrive in strength. Beginning in March, German forces launched massive attacks along the Western Front, using stormtroop tactics to penetrate British lines and create breakthroughs that might force Britain to negotiate. These attacks achieved initial success, particularly against British Fifth Army positions around St. Quentin, where German forces advanced nearly 40 miles before being stopped.
German soldiers involved in the Spring Offensive encountered British forces that fought with desperate determination. British units that had been overrun in the initial attacks rallied and counterattacked. British reserves moved forward to plug gaps in the line. Most critically, British artillery demonstrated its power, concentrating fire on advancing German troops and disrupting attacks before they could achieve their objectives. German soldiers who had advanced rapidly in the war's first days found themselves slowing down, exhausting their momentum, running out of supplies as they outpaced their logistics. The Spring Offensive also revealed to German soldiers how materially inferior they were to their British opponents. German storm troops advancing through captured British positions found supply dumps filled with food, equipment, and ammunition beyond anything German units possessed. Some German soldiers, starving after years of inadequate rations, stopped to loot British supplies rather than continuing their advance. Discipline broke down in some units as soldiers gorged themselves on British food or searched for valuables to send home. The discovery of British material abundance while German soldiers were barely subsisting drove home the hopelessness of Germany's strategic position. British counterattacks in summer and autumn 1918 demonstrated how far the British Army had evolved since 1916. The Battle of Amiens in August, which marked the beginning of the 100 Days Offensive, saw British and Commonwealth forces attack with sophisticated combined arms tactics. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft worked together in coordinated operations that broke through German defenses and sent German units retreating. German soldiers who had held their ground against massive British attacks in 1916 and 1917 found themselves unable to stop British advances in 1918. A German officer captured during the 100 Days Offensive described his unit's experience in September 1918. His battalion had been ordered to hold a defensive position near the Hindenburg Line. British aircraft controlled the skies, strafing German positions and directing artillery fire. British tanks approached, supported by infantry and preceded by artillery barrages. His battalion's anti-tank guns destroyed several tanks, but more kept coming. British infantry infiltrated around strongpoints rather than attacking them directly. When his position was threatened with encirclement, he ordered withdrawal, but British cavalry had already moved to block his retreat route. His battalion, trapped and cut off, surrendered after a brief fight. What struck this officer about his capture was the professionalism of his captors. British soldiers secured the prisoners efficiently, searched them for weapons and intelligence, and moved them to the rear through an organized prisoner collection system. British officers interrogated captured German officers courteously, asking about unit strengths and positions, but not pressing when Germans refused to provide detailed information. The British seemed confident, almost relaxed, certain of victory. German prisoners, by contrast, were demoralized, aware that their army was collapsing and the war was lost. By October 1918, German soldiers on the Western Front knew they were beaten. Units dissolved as men deserted or simply stopped fighting. Officers lost control of troops who refused to attack or defend positions they knew were untenable. The German army that had been one of the world's finest military forces in 1914 was disintegrating. Not primarily because of defeats in battle, but because soldiers had lost faith in victory and saw no reason to continue dying. British forces pushing forward in the war's final weeks encountered German resistance that was increasingly sporadic. Some German units fought determinedly, holding positions until overrun. Others retreated without fighting, abandoning equipment and supplies. Some surrendered en masse when approached by British forces. German soldiers who had spent years in the trenches, who had endured bombardments and gas attacks and trench raids, who had seen friends die and positions captured and lost and recaptured, reached their breaking point. The war ended not with a dramatic German collapse, but with a gradual dissolution of German combat power as exhausted soldiers simply stopped fighting. German perceptions of British forces at war's end mixed respect with resentment. German soldiers acknowledged that British forces had improved dramatically since 1914, that British tactics had become more sophisticated, that British material superiority had proven decisive.
But many German soldiers also believed that Germany had not been defeated militarily so much as worn down by the weight of British resources. German soldiers could claim they had fought bravely, that they had often outfought their British opponents tactically, that they had held their ground for 4 years against overwhelming odds. This narrative that Germany had lost the war but German soldiers had not been defeated would prove influential in the interwar period. It allowed German veterans to maintain their self-respect despite defeat. It provided a foundation for claims that Germany could have won if only political leadership had been better, or if civilians on the home front had shown more determination. And it shaped how Germans would approach the next war with Britain, with assumptions about British forces that reflected both the real experiences of 1914 to 1918 and the myths Germans had constructed about those experiences.
The armistice of November 11, 1918 ended the fighting, but not the war's influence on those who had survived it. In the decades between the world wars, German veterans processed their experiences, wrote memoirs, and constructed narratives about what had happened and why. These narratives would shape how Germans thought about the British, about warfare, and about their own nation's place in the world. Understanding these interwar perspectives helps explain how Germany approached the Second World War, with both memories of British strength and illusions about German superiority. The literature that emerged from German veterans in the 1920s and 1930s reflected complicated attitudes toward their British opponents. Ernst Jünger's Storm of Steel, published in 1920, presented British soldiers as worthy adversaries who fought with courage and professionalism. Jünger did not demonize the British or blame them for German defeat. He acknowledged that British forces had been formidable opponents who fought well. But his account also emphasized German tactical superiority, suggesting that German soldiers had been better fighters even if British resources had ultimately prevailed. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, published in 1929, took a different approach. Remarque's semi-autobiographical novel portrayed the war as a meaningless slaughter that destroyed an entire generation. British soldiers appear in his account primarily as enemies who must be killed or who will kill you, faceless opponents whose nationality matters less than their role in the war machine. Remarque's British soldiers are not particularly competent or incompetent, brave or cowardly. They simply are, another element of the war's horror. These divergent narratives, Jünger's account of a meaningful, if ultimately unsuccessful struggle, and Remarque's account of meaningless destruction, both influenced how Germans remembered the British. Jünger's perspective allowed German veterans to maintain pride in their military service while acknowledging defeat. Remarque's perspective suggested that blame should be directed not at British soldiers or German soldiers, but at the war itself and the political leaders who had caused it. German military professionals in the interwar period studied the lessons of the First World War with particular attention to British tactics and capabilities. The German army, restricted by the Treaty of Versailles to 100,000 men, became a cadre force of professional soldiers who studied tactics, strategy, and technology in preparation for a future war that many assumed would eventually come. German officers examined British combined arms tactics, British use of tanks and aircraft, British artillery methods. They recognized that British forces had evolved significantly during the war and would likely be even more formidable opponents in any future conflict. But German military analysis also identified what they saw as British weaknesses. British tactics remained methodical and predictable. British command structures seemed rigid, with less emphasis on initiative at junior levels than German doctrine prescribed. British forces had won through material superiority and determination, rather than through tactical brilliance. German officers concluded that while British forces should not be underestimated, superior German tactical skills might overcome British material advantages, at least in the early stages of any future conflict. The Nazi Party, which came to power in 1933, promoted narratives about the First World War that blamed Germany's defeat on internal betrayal rather than military failure. The infamous stab-in-the-back myth claimed that Germany had been defeated not by Allied armies, but by socialists, communists, and Jews who had undermined the war effort from within. This myth served Nazi political purposes but distorted reality. The German army had been defeated militarily, worn down by 4 years of combat that consumed its best soldiers and exhausted its resources.
Nazi propaganda regarding Britain mixed respect with contempt. Britain was portrayed as a nation of shopkeepers, commercially minded but lacking martial spirit. British soldiers were depicted as brave enough individually but poorly led and lacking the ideological commitment that Nazism promoted. Yet, Nazi leaders also recognized that Britain remained a major power with substantial military capabilities. Hitler himself apparently admired certain aspects of British imperialism and hoped Britain might be convinced to accept German dominance in continental Europe in exchange for Germany respecting British overseas interests. British and German veterans of the First World War sometimes encountered each other in the interwar period. Some traveled to former battlefields, visiting the cemeteries where comrades were buried. These encounters were generally respectful. Former enemies recognized shared experiences and mutual suffering. British and German veterans could acknowledge each other as soldiers who had done their duty, setting aside national enmities in recognition of common humanity. But these personal connections did little to prevent the next war. The broader political and economic forces driving Germany toward conflict overwhelmed individual relationships between veterans. The Treaty of Versailles, perceived by Germans as unjust and punitive, created resentment that Nazi propaganda exploited. Economic depression and political instability in Germany created conditions where promises of national renewal and revenge appealed to millions. By the late 1930s, as Germany rearmed and expanded, another war with Britain seemed increasingly likely. German military planning for a future war with Britain reflected lessons learned from 1914-1918. Germany would need to defeat France quickly before British strength could be brought to bear. Germany would need to avoid the trench warfare stalemate that had characterized the Western Front. Germany would need to use superior tactics and mobility to overcome British material advantages. The Blitzkrieg doctrine that Germany developed emphasized speed, mechanization, and combined arms operations designed to win decisive victories before enemies could mobilize their full strength. These plans assumed that British forces would be much as they had been in the First World War, individually brave and well-equipped, but unimaginatively led, relying on firepower and material superiority rather than maneuver and initiative. German planners believed they could exploit British predictability, using speed and surprise to achieve victories before British forces could respond effectively. These assumptions would prove partially correct in 1940, but increasingly wrong as the Second World War continued. The memory of fighting the British in 1914-1918 was thus a complex mixture of respect, resentment, and miscalculation. German soldiers remembered British determination and British firepower. They remembered attacks that kept coming despite horrific casualties. They remembered artillery bombardments that turned the battlefield into hell. But they also remembered achieving tactical successes against British forces, stopping British attacks, launching counterattacks that recaptured lost ground. These memories fed into narratives that emphasized German tactical superiority while acknowledging ultimate defeat. When war came again in 1939, German soldiers would find themselves once more facing the British Army. The uniforms would be different, the weapons more advanced, the tactics evolved. But fundamentally, German soldiers would find themselves fighting an enemy they recognized from their father's war, and they would discover that some things about fighting the British had not changed at all.
When the Second World War began in September 1939, few German soldiers expected to fight the British immediately. Germany's war was with Poland, and while Britain and France declared war to honor their alliance with Poland, the British expeditionary force that deployed to France numbered only about 150,000 men initially. This was actually larger than the BEF of 1914, but still small compared to French forces and the massive German Wehrmacht that had conquered Poland in just over a month. The phony war period from September 1939 to May 1940 saw little actual fighting between British and German forces. British troops deployed along the French border, dug defensive positions, and waited. German forces, having defeated Poland, prepared for operations against France and the Low Countries. During this period, propaganda on both sides emphasized respective military strengths while downplaying the enemy's capabilities. German propaganda depicted the British as the same decadent, unmartial nation they had claimed Britain was in 1914. British propaganda portrayed Germans as militaristic barbarians who would be stopped by British and French forces working together. When the German offensive finally came on May 10, 1940, it shattered these illusions on both sides. German forces attacked through the Ardennes, the supposedly impassable forested region that French defensive planning had largely ignored. Panzer divisions raced through French defenses, achieving a breakthrough that split Allied forces and drove toward the English Channel. The blitzkrieg tactics that Germany had developed in the interwar period proved devastatingly effective against an Allied military establishment that was still thinking in terms of 1918. British forces in France and Belgium fought desperately to stem the German advance, but were repeatedly outmaneuvered and outfought. German soldiers encountering British units in 1940 found opponents who fought with determination but who seemed unable to adapt to the pace and mobility of modern warfare. British counterattacks were poorly coordinated, launched piecemeal without adequate support. British retreats, while conducted in good order, allowed German forces to maintain initiative and continue advancing. The evacuation from Dunkirk at the end of May 1940 saw over 330,000 British and French soldiers rescued from the beaches and harbor, but it represented a decisive military defeat. German soldiers who reached Dunkirk after the evacuation found enormous quantities of abandoned British equipment. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, rifles, all left behind as the British Expeditionary Force fled back to Britain. German soldiers examining this equipment noted its quality. British tanks, though inferior to German panzers in 1940, were well made. British trucks and vehicles demonstrated industrial capability. The sheer quantity of abandoned material suggested the scale of British losses. But German perceptions of British fighting qualities in 1940 were complicated. British soldiers had fought bravely in many engagements. At Arras on May 21st, a British counterattack briefly threatened to cut German supply lines and created panic in German headquarters. Though the attack was eventually stopped, it demonstrated that British forces could still mount effective operations. At Calais, British troops held out for several crucial days, delaying German forces and allowing more time for the Dunkirk evacuation. These rearguard actions, though ending in defeat, showed that British soldiers could fight effectively when properly led and supported. The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over England in summer 1940, gave German pilots and aircrew their first sustained contact with British forces defending their homeland. German Luftwaffe pilots found British fighters and pilots formidable opponents. The Spitfire and Hurricane aircraft that equipped RAF Fighter Command were capable machines, flown by skilled pilots who demonstrated courage and tactical competence. German bomber crews learned to fear British fighters that would attack with determination, pressing their attacks despite German defensive fire. More importantly, the Battle of Britain demonstrated British determination to continue fighting, despite having been defeated in France. Hitler had apparently expected Britain to negotiate peace after Dunkirk, to accept that Germany had won in Europe and that continued resistance was pointless. Instead, Britain not only refused to negotiate, but prepared to continue fighting alone. This resilience surprised German leaders who had believed British morale would collapse after the defeats of 1940. The North African campaign, beginning in 1941, provided German soldiers with extensive opportunities to observe British forces in combat. Erwin Rommel, now commanding the Africa Corps, faced British forces in a mobile campaign across the desert that bore little resemblance to the trench warfare of 1914 to 1918. Here, tanks maneuvered across open terrain, battles were fought at long range, and logistics determined who could continue fighting. German soldiers in North Africa developed nuanced views of their British opponents based on 2 years of combat under these unique conditions. A German veteran of the Africa Corps interviewed after the war described British forces as competent and professional, but overly cautious. British commanders, he said, would only attack when they had overwhelming superiority in men and materiel. When British attacks came, they were methodically planned and executed, with careful coordination between arms.
But British forces lacked the flexibility and initiative to exploit opportunities. If a British attack succeeded in breaking through, British commanders would consolidate and call for reinforcements rather than pushing forward to exploit the breakthrough. This assessment reflects a broader perspective on British forces in World War II. British soldiers were brave and their equipment was good, but British tactics remained predictable. German commanders learned to anticipate British operational patterns. British attacks would be preceded by extensive artillery bombardments. British forces would advance to objectives and then halt to consolidate. British responses to German attacks would be methodical rather than improvised. This predictability allowed German forces to prepare effective defenses and counterattacks even when outnumbered.
But German soldiers in North Africa also learned to respect British firepower and material resources. British artillery, as in World War I, could deliver crushing bombardments. British tanks, particularly the American-made Grant and Sherman tanks that arrived in 1942, were superior to earlier British models and competitive with German panzers. British logistics, operating from Egypt through established supply lines, provided a steady flow of reinforcements and supplies, while German forces in North Africa struggled with extended supply lines across the Mediterranean. The Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 demonstrated both British strengths and German weaknesses in stark terms. British forces under Montgomery attacked with over 1,000 tanks, supported by overwhelming artillery and air superiority. German and Italian forces, outnumbered and short of fuel and ammunition, fought desperately but could not stop the British advance. The battle lasted nearly 2 weeks, with British forces grinding forward through German defenses in a methodical offensive that exemplified Montgomery's approach. German survivors noted that British tactics were unimaginative but effective. British forces simply overwhelmed German defenses through weight of numbers and firepower. German prisoners captured at El Alamein and in the subsequent pursuit across Libya expressed grudging respect for British determination. One captured German officer noted that British soldiers continued to attack even when suffering heavy casualties, maintained discipline under fire, and followed orders without hesitation. These were the same qualities German soldiers had observed in 1914-1918. British soldiers might not be as individually aggressive or tactically flexible as German soldiers, but they would follow orders, do their duty, and keep fighting until told to stop. The invasion of Italy in 1943 and the landings in Normandy in 1944 brought German forces into contact with larger British forces operating as part of Allied coalition operations. German soldiers fighting in these campaigns noted differences between British, Canadian, and American forces that reflected national characteristics and operational doctrines. British forces were methodical and carefully planned operations before executing them. Canadians were aggressive and tough opponents. Americans were enthusiastic and willing to accept casualties, but sometimes lacked tactical sophistication. A German veteran of the fighting in Normandy described his experience facing British forces in the weeks after D-Day. His unit had been positioned in defensive positions overlooking the landing beaches, but Allied air superiority and naval gunfire made movement during daylight suicidal. British attacks came with massive artillery support that destroyed German defensive positions before infantry advanced. British armor, operating in close cooperation with infantry, methodically cleared German strongpoints. His unit was eventually forced to withdraw, having suffered heavy casualties from constant bombardment and repeated British attacks. This veteran noted that British soldiers in Normandy seemed better trained and more confident than British forces in earlier campaigns. They used combined arms tactics effectively, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. British officers demonstrated tactical competence, adapting to circumstances and showing initiative when needed. The British Army of 1944, he concluded, had learned from its defeats and had become a formidable fighting force. But German assessments of British forces in 1944-1945 still emphasized caution and methodical operations as dominant British characteristics. British forces would not attack until everything was prepared, until overwhelming force was assembled, until artillery support was organized. This approach reduced British casualties, but sometimes allowed German forces to prepare defenses or withdraw to new positions.
German commanders learned that British attacks could be predicted and prepared for, even if they could not always be stopped. The contrast with American forces was particularly notable to German soldiers who fought against both. Americans, German veterans said, were more aggressive but less disciplined than British forces. American units would attack with less preparation, taking more casualties but sometimes achieving breakthroughs through sheer aggression. American commanders seemed willing to take risks that British commanders avoided. American logistics and firepower were even more overwhelming than British capabilities, reflecting America's massive industrial capacity. Late in the war, as Germany's position became increasingly hopeless, German soldier views of their British opponents reflected exhaustion and resignation more than tactical assessment. Germany was being overwhelmed by Allied material superiority. Cities were being bombed to ruins. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. Italy had surrendered. The war was obviously lost. British soldiers in this context were simply another element of the overwhelming force that was crushing Germany. German prisoners captured in the final months of the war often expressed relief at being captured by British or American forces rather than Soviets. While all captivity was difficult, German prisoners believed Western allies would treat them according to international law. British captors, German prisoners noted, were generally correct, if not friendly. They provided food, medical care, and shelter. They followed the Geneva Convention. British interrogators were professional, asking questions but not using torture or extreme coercion. This treatment stood in stark contrast to what German soldiers expected if captured by Soviet forces. Post-war interviews with German veterans revealed that many retained respect for British forces even decades after the war. British soldiers, they said, had been worthy opponents who fought with courage and determination. British forces had been well-equipped and well-led. German veterans might argue that German tactical skills had been superior, but they acknowledged that British material resources and determination had proven decisive. The British had not been the soft, decadent enemy that Nazi propaganda had portrayed. They had been professional soldiers doing their duty, much like German soldiers had been. This post-war respect was complicated by the Rommel myth, the legend that had grown around Erwin Rommel's campaigns in North Africa. British authors and historians had contributed to this myth, portraying Rommel as a brilliant commander and chivalrous enemy. The myth served British purposes, allowing them to explain defeats in North Africa as being due to facing a military genius rather than British failures. But it also reflected genuine respect for a formidable opponent. German veterans generally endorsed the Rommel myth, seeing it as validation of German military competence even in defeat. The German perspective on British forces across two world wars thus reveals continuities and evolutions. British soldiers remained steady, disciplined, and determined in both conflicts. British tactics remained methodical and firepower dependent. British material superiority grew even more overwhelming in World War II than it had been in World War I. But British forces also adapted and improved, learning from defeats and developing more sophisticated capabilities. The British Army of 1944 that German soldiers faced was far more dangerous than the British Army of 1914, though recognizably similar in character.
German perspectives on British soldiers across two world wars revealed truths about warfare, national character, and the complex humanity that persists even in circumstances designed to dehumanize. These perspectives matter not just as historical curiosities, but as insights into how soldiers perceive those they fight against, how respect can coexist with enmity, and how the reality of combat shapes understanding in ways that propaganda cannot. When German soldiers looked across no man's land at the British Tommy, when they watched British officers lead attacks from the front, when they endured days of British artillery bombardments, when they fought tank battles in the desert or defensive actions in Normandy, they were measuring an opponent. This measurement was practical, aimed at understanding how to fight effectively against this particular enemy. But it was also personal, a recognition that the soldiers in the opposing trench or tank were men much like themselves, caught in circumstances beyond their control, trying to survive while doing their duty. The fundamental characteristic that German soldiers attributed to British forces was steadiness. British soldiers did not panic easily, maintained discipline under fire, and could be relied upon to hold their ground even in desperate circumstances. This quality made British forces dangerous defenders who had to be defeated through overwhelming force rather than through psychological pressure or tactical tricks. German commanders planning operations against British positions knew that British units would have to be destroyed rather than simply dislodged or demoralized. But German soldiers also noted what they perceived as British tactical conservatism. British attacks followed predictable patterns, with heavy artillery preparation followed by methodical infantry advances. British forces consolidated captured positions rather than exploiting breakthroughs. British commanders seemed risk-averse, unwilling to gamble or improvise. This predictability gave German defenders opportunities to prepare effective responses, even when outnumbered or outgunned. The fundamental characteristic that German soldiers attributed to British forces was admiration. British soldiers did not panic easily, maintained discipline under fire, and could be relied upon to hold their ground even in desperate circumstances. This quality made British forces dangerous defenders who had to be defeated through overwhelming force rather than through psychological pressure or tactical tricks. German commanders planning operations against British positions knew that British units would have to be destroyed rather than simply dislodged or demoralized. But German soldiers also noted what they perceived as British tactical conservatism. British attacks followed predictable patterns, with heavy artillery preparation followed by methodical infantry advances. British forces consolidated captured positions rather than exploiting breakthroughs. British commanders seemed risk-averse, unwilling to gamble or improvise. This predictability gave German defenders opportunities to prepare effective responses, even when outnumbered or outgunned. The respect German soldiers expressed for British courage was genuine. Watching British infantry advance across no man's land into machine gun fire, seeing British officers lead from the front despite horrific casualty rates, encountering British prisoners who maintained their composure despite defeat, all created recognition of shared military professionalism. The British soldier might be the enemy, but he was a soldier nonetheless, deserving of respect for doing his duty under terrible conditions. Commonwealth forces earned even stronger respect, tinged with fear. Canadians and Australians fought with aggression and skill that made them particularly dangerous opponents. German intelligence reports identifying Canadian or Australian units in a sector led to increased vigilance and reinforcement. The colonial soldiers seemed to combine British discipline with a rougher, more aggressive approach to combat. They specialized in raids and infiltration tactics that terrified German soldiers, who never knew when Canadian raiders might emerge from the darkness to kill or capture them. German views of the British officer class revealed admiration for personal courage mixed with criticism of senior leadership. British junior officers who led from the front, who shared dangers with their men, earned respect from German soldiers and officers alike. But British generals seemed to German observers to lack the tactical brilliance and operational flexibility that German military culture valued. British commanders won through material superiority and determination rather than through tactical innovation. The material superiority that Britain brought to bear, particularly in World War I, fundamentally shaped German perceptions. By 1917 and 1918, German soldiers recognized they were fighting an enemy with effectively unlimited resources. British artillery could fire more shells in a day than Germany possessed in strategic reserves. British soldiers received food, equipment, and ammunition in quantities German soldiers could only dream of. British industry produced weapons and supplies at rates Germany could not match. This material disparity, more than any tactical factor, convinced German soldiers that the war could not be won. The evolution of British tactics and capabilities across both wars demonstrated that British forces could learn and adapt. The British Army of 1918 was vastly more effective than the British Army of 1914. British combined arms tactics, coordination between infantry and artillery, use of tanks and aircraft all improved dramatically through painful experience. Similarly, the British Army of 1944 was more sophisticated and dangerous than British forces in 1940. German soldiers who fought in both wars noted these improvements, even as they maintained that German tactical skills remained superior. The
The question of whether German soldiers' assessments of British forces were accurate is complicated. German perspectives were shaped by their own experiences, cultural assumptions, and propaganda. German soldiers might attribute British tactical conservatism to lack of initiative, when it actually reflected careful planning and risk management. They might see British reliance on firepower as evidence of dependence on material superiority, when it actually demonstrated smart use of available resources. German claims of tactical superiority became less credible as Germany lost both wars despite this supposed advantage.
But German perspectives also contained significant accuracy. British tactics were methodical and predictable. British forces did rely heavily on material superiority. British commanders at senior levels made significant mistakes in both wars. German tactical skills at the small unit level were genuinely impressive, as multiple British commanders acknowledged. The truth lies somewhere between German claims of superiority and British counterclaims. German and British forces had different strengths and weaknesses, different approaches to warfare, different cultural assumptions about how battles should be fought. What German perspectives ultimately reveal is that British soldiers earned respect through their performance in two global conflicts. They were not the soft civilians of propaganda stereotypes. They were not easily defeated or demoralized. They maintained discipline and cohesion even in terrible circumstances. They kept fighting even when defeat seemed likely. These qualities, perhaps more than tactical brilliance or technological superiority, ultimately proved decisive. The British approach to warfare, methodical and firepower dependent, proved effective because it could be sustained. British tactics might not win brilliant victories, but they wore down opponents through attrition. British material superiority might not reflect tactical genius, but it provided armies with the resources needed to keep fighting. British determination might not be as inspiring as more aggressive warrior cultures, but it meant British forces would not quit until the war was won. German soldiers recognized these qualities in their British opponents, even if they did not always appreciate their significance. A German veteran of both world wars, interviewed in the 1970s, summarized his experiences fighting the British with the observation that British soldiers were never as good as German soldiers in any particular aspect of warfare, but they always had more of everything. More men, more tanks, more artillery, more supplies, and crucially, more determination to keep fighting no matter how long it took. This determination, perhaps more than any other factor, explains why Germany lost both wars despite initially defeating British forces in battle. The British would not accept defeat as final. They would rebuild, rearm, and return. They would outlast their opponents. German soldiers who fought at the Somme understood this, even if their leaders did not. The British would keep coming, wave after wave, until Germany could not continue fighting. The relationship between enemies who respect each other is complex. German and British soldiers recognized shared experiences and mutual professionalism even as they tried to kill each other. This recognition did not prevent the fighting or reduce its intensity, but it did preserve some remnant of humanity in circumstances designed to eliminate human feeling. The fact that German soldiers could acknowledge British courage, that British soldiers could respect German tactical skill, suggests that even in total war, some human connection persists. For those of us trying to understand these conflicts decades later, German perspectives on British soldiers provide valuable insights. They remind us that the enemy is not a monolithic evil, but rather individual human beings doing their duty as they understand it. They show us how soldiers' views of their opponents evolve through shared experience of combat. They demonstrate that respect and enmity can coexist, that professional soldiers can acknowledge their opponent's skills even while fighting against them. The German soldier looking across at the British Tommy saw a mirror image of himself, a man in uniform, far from home, following orders, trying to survive. They might have been friends in different circumstances. They might have shared interests and values, but war had made them enemies and duty required them to fight. Understanding this complexity, this mixture of respect and enmity, professional acknowledgement and national conflict, helps us appreciate the full tragedy of these wars and the experiences of those who fought them. If you found this deep exploration of German perspectives on British soldiers valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. We are dedicated to bringing you thoroughly researched historical content that examines battlefield secrets World War II from multiple perspectives. Understanding how enemies viewed each other provides crucial insights into these conflicts that cannot be gained from studying only one side. Share this video with others who appreciate nuanced historical analysis, and leave a comment telling us which aspect of the World Wars you would like us to explore next. Your support allows us to continue producing detailed, well-researched content that brings important historical truths to new audiences.